Thank you very much for being here. Happy to have you here in Bogota, welcoming this SIEL event, and in particular for this panel that is a very interesting topic, is the multipolar rivalry and the geopolitics and economics of China and Latin America and the Caribbean, also with regards to trade and finance relationships. Here we have a wonderful panel. Unfortunately, one of our panel members is not here, but our panel is fantastic. We have Ivan Filipe Fernandes from the Federal University of ABC in Brazil. We have Meryl Thiel, High Commissioner for the Protection of Rights and Liberties in Monaco. Our friend Keith Norris from the College of Science and Technology and Applied Arts of Trinidad and Tobago, and my name is Mauricio Salcedo. I am professor at this university, and I also work at the Ministry of Trade of Colombia. So to kick out this discussion, we are going to talk first. We'll have Ivan speaking to us, and he has a very interesting work in progress with regards to this relationship between the collapse of the DSB and the appellate body and the multilateral trade rules-based system, and the situation, this tension that we are living between China and the US. So Ivan, if you can go on and present your paper and try to elaborate on this, it will be very interesting, and afterwards we'll have a chance to have some inquiries on your work. Please go ahead.
Thanks a lot, Mauricio, Kate, and Meryl. It's a pleasure to be here. My English is not so good, but I hope you'll be able to understand me. I will be on my foot, but I think I will speak a little better. This part is of a work in progress that I'm trying to understand what are the possibilities of Brazilian foreign policy during this new geopolitical confrontation between the United States and China. So this is the first part that I want to understand the effects of this political confrontation. What could be the best illustration of the Pax Americana, when the United States was the really unipolar power. The WTO is the best illustration of this moment in history, and right now it's being a lot of challenge with the rising of China, and mostly not by China, by the US reactions for the rising of China inside the OMC, so the WTO. So you try to understand what are the effects of changes in global power to very dense institutional regimes. And we have two great challenges right now in the international trade regime. That is the DBS crisis and the great multi-regional trade agreements that have been on the radar since 2006. So our research question in this first part of the project is how complex international regimes evolve when facing with structural challenge for international hegemony in a dense institutional order, and specifically for WTO, what's the effect of the rise of China, and is WTO doomed, or it will be a new era for multilateral trade? For a little disclaimer on the project, that I'm a political scientist, I'm not a legal scholar, so I'm having different eyes on these questions about the changes in the new bipolarity in the international system. My theoretical framework, I will not lose a lot of time on those issues, but it is the two-seat trap from theory of Graham Allison, and on the other side, how Hannah Poe says that there is no existential threat between China and the United States. They have a lot of integration. China have been a peaceful rising, trying to present itself as a responsible great power. In the end of the day, in the most important institutions in the international system, China has a position of great power that is in United Security Council. So in the end of the day, the great stress in international systems are happening right now in the economic institutions. From within, that we will look a little on WTO, and overlapping new institutions as BRICS, as the New Development Bank that China is proposing in Asia. A little of more on our theoretical framework is how we can understand a lot of change happening inside WTO with incremental change. We are in a very different situation than the 90s without any rupture inside the system, because the actors were reorganizing themselves, putting pressure in the system and changing by inside, as we can use the concepts developed by Mahoney and Thiel as layer change. You have put new overlapping rules and new interpretations of those already established rules, and we can think that the progress of DBS and the failure after that of DBS is connected with that, and the conversion by doing on this institution. So without a critical juncture, there is a significant institutional change within WTO, and we will look on three potential tipping points. The dispute settlement body stands still. I will not talk a lot on that because people here it's very well know about what happens. The new areas of RTAs by both China and US to bypass the deadlock of WTO, and the trade war between United States and China that can perhaps anticipate what will happen in this new era of mega regional agreements. First of all, if you look on the complaints to DBS, actually there is a lot of people outside the three main economic institutions that are using the DBS, but mostly you see a very decrease of United States participation in the institution. So there is a reaction of the United States inside the WTO with the rising power of China and the institution. United States had 60%, 30% of the all complaints made in the first 5 years. And in the last 5 years, it was just 15%. And there is increasing in the percentage of DBS complaints of the rest of the world from 38% to 64%. The other side of that is the appellate body stands still. There is a political pressure of US against incremental change in the DBS with the consolidation of a quasi-judicial system. And it's very interesting to see that China has a very regular acceptance of DBS decisions. So actually, I want to explore the hypothesis that United States strategy to don't nominate any other appellate board members is not related with the quasi-judicial system that is the legal argument that is presented, but actually is something about political power. How can eliminate institutions in the international system that could be used by China to put pressure on new policies that the United States are trying to present for fomenting this industrial recovery. And last, we have these new and great RTAs that are negotiating outside the WTO forum with the collapse of Doha round. There is a lot of examples of this that are wrapping right now. Some of them were signed and others are also in a deadlock. But there is indication that something is very different going on in the international trade regime that we can connect with the trade wars of Trump that can anticipate what's happening with these new trade orders. There is the reaction of US with using measures that was not WTO consistent, and also the reactions of China on that. There is a very nice piece published this year by Dadesh and Pross in the World Trade Review that they propose a potential densification of the liberalization between those regions that are inside those trade agreements and power politics between those trade regimes. If you look on this new world of PTAs agreements, and I present here a network of every PTA that was signed in 2010 and was actually going on in 2010 and 2017, we can see that there is something very different happens. There is 500,000 dyads between in 2010. Right now, we have more than 6,000 dyads. Increase that it was not so big. I was expecting to see something bigger than this 15% increase. But important that the China and US was much more closer in 2010 than they are right now. This is US, this is China. You cannot read, I cannot read right now, but when I was in my computer, I could read those names. So here's US, here is China. And so this is the situation that we have in the international system. And how is the reactions of the LEC regime? And apart from that, now I'm going to try to think the possibilities of LEC regime during these new tensions in the global system. And I start to look in how the Latin American countries are in these networks of PTAs. First of all, the Caribbean countries are outside the ball in 2010 and 2017. It's a really clear pattern here. The Mexico, Peru, and Chile are close to USA. They are not so close in 2010. They are very close right now. And Mercosur, it's really, really connected with China right now. Mercosur, Brazil, Uruguay, Argentina, Paraguay, they are very close to China. China is in the middle of that. China, it's above here. And those four words that nobody can see, they are close. And that's very interesting. Also, that United States and China, they are not here. They are not in the middle of the both. They are in the core, but in the periphery of the core. You know, it was expected that they could be more in the middle of those streets. And what we have here is European Union. They are European countries. So, and what we have else for LEC regime? Brazil and Mercosur bet at the Doha round and filed miserable. Mercosur and European Union are trying to ratify, but there is a lot of dispute. There are environmental issues in European Union and Brazilian new old industrial policy that we are trying to do what we did in the 70s right now to reindustrialize the country. On the other side, there is the consolidation of BRICS, the new development bank, the continuing reserve arrangements that presents new options for Brazil. It's important to see that in the second half of the 20th century, the largest increase of economic growth per capita, that what affects people's life, was during the China boom. It was not during the import substitution moment. It was bigger right now. It's smaller in GDP growth because there is a smaller growth of population during this time. So what we can expect for the ATO system? Great stress in the international regime. We are going to see something like more a quotation club trade regimes against the MFN. If the system collapse or a possible institutional readjustment, it's very difficult to see something happen right now that can readjourn the WTO. And for the LEC regime, that I think we should talk a little more on this panel, there is very low expectations of gaining the multilateral or plurilateral system. There is a strong protectionist wave in the global north for industrialization, the Ships and Science Act in the US that we talked a lot yesterday, environmental and national security issues, and also that is part that we not talk in this conference, the nomadic policy in the US and the United States. The losers of globalization are the working class of the developed country, and they have put a lot of pressure in the political system of the developed countries to have answers for the loss of jobs. So the spread of political populism is really connected with this, the losing jobs during the globalization. And also for China, it's the most important partner in South America. We are going to see international trade system as the third is when Brazil and Argentina could bargain with US and also with Nazi Germany, because Nazi Germany were offering public goods for South American countries, and China is offering much more public goods than Nazi Germany could possibly provide in that moment. We can see the Belt and Road Initiative that China started to fund in the URSA project of infrastructure reform in South America after the Brazilian collapse of BNDES during the caused by the corruption scandal of car wash, and providing a lot of financing for South American countries without many conditionalities. On the other hand, there is a study that was published yesterday by SEBRI, a Brazilian institution of research in international relations, that during the last decade, Brazil lost 10% of the South American industrial market to China. That is a problem that we need to address in this period. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Ivan. Thank you very much for the excellent presentation. So now we will invite to the floor Meryl. Meryl, she has been working on this, basically on this relationship between the US and China and its impact in Latin America. And perhaps I have a couple of questions for you. I mean, some people say that, and especially here in Latin America, and I quote, that the Chinese never forget and the Americans do not appreciate, do not thank enough to its trading partners. So, and yesterday somebody, my friend Greg just reminded me that yesterday somebody told in the keynote speech that if you are not at the table, perhaps you are at the menu. So I was wanting you to elaborate on the specific challenges to promote the rule of law in these convoluted times, and whether the US is withdrawing from Latin America or actually there is a change in strategy. So please go ahead.
Thanks a lot for your question, Mauricio. Thanks a lot. First of all, I really want to apologize for my French, because I'm French, and I struggle a lot because I do speak Spanish, but English is not my language. So I apologize, will do my best. Regarding the situation between China and the US, and before trying to explain why is the key challenge for Latin America, I really want to highlight the tension and the crisis between those two agonists, because we can still criticize or have some different perspective on the Chinese growing situation, but we do have currently two agonists. The main challenge between the US and China, in my opinion, is the artificial intelligence and all that drives with technologies and innovation. When it's about Latin America, the challenge is different, because Latin America is not a big source of production in terms of industry, but you have here raw material, natural resources, and food security that can guarantee some situation for China and for the US. To answer to your question, I want to present some statistics. The first one is made by the ECLAC, in English is CELAC in Espanol. So apparently the trade between China and Latin America in a broad way exceeded 280 billion in before the pandemic in 2018. And similarly, since China became a member of the WTO, we can observe that there is an increase of 18-fold between China and Latin America. That being said, I really want to present Latin America and highlight the singularity of the region. When we talk about Latin America, we talk about a big continent, but we have different blocks, different parts in this. Central America is very different from the South, and we have the Cono Sur, we have the Andean country as well, we have Caribbean, so it's a mix of full region with specialties, cultural, linguistic, historical, and we have to keep this in mind to understand how China can enter into this continent and try to compete with the US. And maybe that's why the US is withdrawing, because they didn't understand the whole specificity of each sub-blocks in the defense. So yeah, first that's about defining and understanding that we have different sub-regions within the state. The second point is about the new Silk Road project of China. And I will try to explain why China has so many interests in coming into this region, Latin America, in 4 points. First, the natural resources and raw materials, such as I mentioned, in terms of petrol, oil, iron, copper, Venezuela and Chile can offer this stability to China. Second point, the food security concerns for China. You have Brazil, you have Argentina that are the largest soybeans producer and exporter. So it means a big security. Third, Latin America, it's hard for me to say that, but it's a little bit more stable in terms of politics and legal system compared with African countries. So for China, the investment, the way to conclude agreements with some countries in Latin America is as well a legal security that they cannot find in Africa. Third point, third sub point, here you have a big market, big population, people who have a certain amount of money compared with African countries. So China can export mechanics, electrical, high-tech products, and have a new market as well. So it's a sort of win-win process that can be created. Last but not least, a little bit more geopolitical, Latin America plays a crucial role for China people to isolate Taiwan. And here we have some different challenges for China here in the region, far from Asia, but that can have a big repercussion in terms of international understanding. So this is a little bit the situation of why Latin America is such a key market for China, not only for trade situation, but as well for geopolitics elements. That being said, I will try to go straight to the point because I'm a lawyer, although I don't look like it. But we have, and that's my main hypothesis, a sort of mimetism between what the US has done and what China's tried to do in terms of legal strategy. When I say that, I want to explain that 3 main free trade agreements have been firmed, signed by the US with Chile, Peru, and Costa Rica. And China tried to do the same. That's at least my hypothesis. China used the same strategy to enter in this continent, Latin America, but a little bit smarter than the US did, because China understood that we have sub-region. So very pragmatically, with Chile, the free trade agreements between Chile and China made in 2006 allowed Chile to become the largest trading partner of China, accounting for 24% of Chile's exports to the world. So for Chile, it has been a big new opportunity to have a real trade partner compared with the free trade agreement that had been done with the US. We can mention that there is a rising of the exports, and in 2005, it was for 5 billion between China and China, and after this free trade agreement, it was around 19 billion. And the main object of this trade is Chilean wine, of course, and Chilean minerals, and yes, I think it's mineral sector, oil and how do you say? Producing, yes. After that, we do have the free trade agreements between China and Peru in 2010, not sure if I'm not mistaken. Here, the link was a little bit more easier because we have a big diaspora, Chinese diaspora in Peru. So it was meant to be for China at that time, and it was easy to negotiate with Peru. Here, the main object was, yes, minerals as well, exportation on that part, but China has been successful in opening a little bit market and trying to propose export with fishes, products, and all what belongs to agropecuario in Spanish.
Agriculture.
So we have definitely a non-traditional export that has been developed between China and Peru thanks to this free trade agreement. And my assumption is that because of the Chinese export and because of this supposed mimetism of the free trade agreement that had been done previously by the US, here for China, it's really a new opportunity, and for Peru as well. Because as an Andean country, it's a new way to get trade relation with a country which is out of the zone. And so to be more competitive. And last, China, Costa Rica. And here we have a point of entrance of China in Central America, which is meaningful because Peru and Chile was in two different regions in Latin America. Here with Costa Rica, we have a classical import-export of agricultural products, so orange juice, either Northern Heights banana. And so China found a market to export new technologies and new technologies, because in Costa Rica, it's one of the more stable markets. So that being said, I think I'm okay. It was my main assumptions, hypothesis of a mimetism between two legal strategies, and China might probably be a winner in this strategy, mainly because of the link she has been able to create in the Chinese diaspora, or the role of Chile and the trade partner that Chile can become, while the US is still in a very dominating position. And although it's just about law and norms, the US has this tendency to use the norms for its own benefits, while China, although she does that as well, doesn't act this way during the negotiation. So it's all about legal strategy.
Okay. Thank you very much, Meryl. We'll have the chance in the second round to discuss these topics. And now I will invite to the floor my friend Kit Nurse and a couple of questions as well.
Sure.
So Kit, well, Kit has been working in this issue of China's financing in Latin America, and perhaps the first question that I have is that is with regards to whether Latin countries can be allies of the US but financed by China. This is in some ways some bipolar situation, kind of crazy. And this take us to the question whether what exactly building strong alliances mean in this multipolar world, and also with regards to your work on financing. I would like you to elaborate on the Belt and Road initiative here in Latin America and how the Latin countries have navigated this initiative. So please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much, Mauricio. My presentation is up. Been a very interesting time, of course. And I really appreciate the conference organizers for selecting the theme of looking at geopolitical fragmentation. Because if you look at the literature on when you have a multipolar system, as opposed to one where you have strong hegemonies, there's a tendency for the erosion of multilateralism and a shift towards bilateralism. You also tend to see a shift towards bloc formations as opposed to multilateral institutions playing a more critical role. What that means generally for countries that let's call them on the periphery is that often they have to decide which bloc they are going to fall under. In some instances, it's not necessarily their choice. You may be incorporated into a bloc. And so in a multipolar system, one of the key issue areas, of course, is trade. but a lot of the trade is undergirded by finance and investment. And so often the trade follows from the financing and the investment infrastructure. So what is evolving is a very interesting scenario whereby China has moved very aggressively in terms of providing development finance, competing with the traditional providers in a massive way. So for example, I looked at the data this morning, and China's development financing was 83% of that for the World Bank. And then if you look at various regions, China's development finance relative to other development financial institutions is quite significant. And then if you look at particular countries, China's development finance in many instances exceeds that of the other, like the multilateral development banks and so on. So I just want to show quickly a couple slides with some data. So this is looking at ODA. So you can see Latin America and Caribbean is not in the same league with Asia and Africa in terms of dependence on ODA. But when you start looking more closely at China's role in terms of financing in this particular region, you start to see that for some countries, I mean, Venezuela is very much an outlier in that regard. It's heavily dependent on China for good political reasons, one can argue, but also you see, other countries, Brazil, Ecuador, Argentina. Most of these Latin American Caribbean countries are in the top 10 borrowers from China. And this is the level of borrowing that we've seen over the last period from 2005 to 2019. So fairly substantial, and across a wide range of countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. And this shows you the spread in terms of the years and the quantum of investment. What we've seen since 2019, or particularly since 2018, is a significant drop-off. And in fact, for 2020 and 2021, China has been lending only 10 billion. So these are the lowest years. So something has changed. So even though China has been utilizing their surplus, the current account surplus as the mechanism for all of this financing, it has begun to drop off and slowing down. So there's been a change of strategy. Nonetheless, what this means though going forward, so this is comparing loans from China compared with loans from the multilateral system. So you can see that China's share is overall is 59%. And for some countries like, subtotal is 116, but for Latin America and the Caribbean, you see substantial, case of Venezuela is a major outlier, but look at Ecuador, but even big in Brazil, and so on. So what does this mean? Some interesting things are starting to happen. So I'm going to flip down to, so this is one interesting case. It's in Financial Times, an interesting article, where China, since it became a member of the IDB, has been able to attract loans and contracts to the tune of 1.8 billion, whereas China's contribution to the IDB is 1%. The United States contributes 30% and was able to only gain contracts of 249 billion. So you hear the critique from the IDB saying, well, Washington allowed China to gain an economic foothold in Latin America by underfunding the lender for years. So China is not just lending money. China is now using its position in Latin America to attract and win contracts from the multilateral development banks. So this is one example, IDB. So this is creating tension within the multilateral development bank system. And then just last month, the case of Suriname has popped up. So Suriname is trying to renegotiate and restructure its debt, but a large share of its debt is with China. And the IMF and the Biden administration are saying to Suriname, which is a really small South American country, in fact, it's possibly the smallest South American country, if I recall correctly. And the IMF and the Biden administration are saying, well, we can't restructure your debt until China plays a role, because right now they view China as free riding on in this scenario. The Chinese response is, well, the IMF gives some parameters relating to debt relief, but for us, I think it is not binding. And so China is saying, well, and we only negotiate with our debtors, so we are only negotiating with the Surinamese government. So what happens now? Suriname is in a bit of a quandary. IMF, US government versus China. So you're now starting to see how this development finance scenario is playing out in some interesting geopolitical implications, both for institutions, but also for Latin American countries. So maybe I'll stop at that point and take it further. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Keith. Very illustrative. So we'll have a second round, giving each of you 7 minutes, if it's fine, just to elaborate on your positions. And perhaps I will start. We'll start with Ivan, and in asking you a couple of questions. The US has not brought cases, perhaps in the last 7 or 8 years, and in the multilateral trade scene, China appears as the champion of the rule of law, and the US appears as the one undermining their trade, their rules-based multilateral trading system. So it will be important if you can give us your insights on this, and also if you can elaborate on where these ideas of near and friendly shoring and massive export controls are impacting this multilateral trade scenario, as well as the regional trade scenarios. And perhaps the last question is that where this is the end of the Monroe Doctrine, and perhaps I will repeat this question to Meryl. After 200 years, the US is really withdrawing from Latin America. So please go ahead.
First of all, I think that there is an issue on the DBS that at the first impression is that that's happening. China is behaving as the rule of law in the champion in the trade system, and the US is putting stress on that. It's trying to, we want to do things that is not WTO consistent. The question about that is that there is low transparency on what China is doing. So they are indicating they are complying with the WTO rules, but in the end of the day, as the professor made the question there in the first day of the conference, we don't know who are ruling the industrial policy in China. So actually we have no critical information about China's policies, if they are really complying with the decisions that were made on the WTO or not. But there is an open question. I don't know if anybody has tried to see this data, to see if really China is complying with WTO rules. But the first pressure is that is happening. The second one is about the friendly shoring. That is a very old theoretical debate about relative gains and absolute gains. In international relations theory, there was a strong debate in the 80s that when we can have countries complying with the international system when they are not afraid of insecurity issues. So they can rely on cooperation to gain absolute gains, to provide efficiency for the international system. But at the moment that you are not more cooperating with somebody that you realize that your security will be provided, you are not more gambling on absolute gains. You are gambling on relative gains. So when you are trying to near friendly shoring or to near or friendly shoring, you are losing efficiency because China is the industrial powerhouse of the world, but there is the question of relative increments of cooperation with China against US. And right now, US is being threatened by China rising. And actually, the main example of this threat is how China is being able to come to Latin America. Why the United States was not lending to Latin America? Because Latin America was part of the United States territory, extra territory. It was not a problem. It was not a geopolitical problem. There is the biggest country in South America, it's Brazil. Brazil is very friendly to the United States. Brazil is very friendly to everybody. We don't have a very strong military. We don't have security issues in South America. So we need to find cooperation to provide development for Brazil. We are not threatening anybody, even the small countries of South America, the big ones, and much less the United States. So there was no, it was not a problem for the United States to keep track of Latin America. It could leave Latin America for the Latin Americans during the last 30 years. But right now, China is coming here. The United States made the pivot for Asia, but right now they need to look, how can we take back Latin America for us again? Because China is providing a lot of food goods. China is the main partner of South America, main partner, trade partner of Central America, and not just is the main trade partner. It's provide loans, it's provide many public goods that the United States stopped to provide and led to the private sector to do that in Latin America. So they need to make a new approach to the region, or in the end of the day, you need to fight against China perhaps in South America. I could not say something about that in Mexico. Mexico is too close to the United States. It don't have this kind of liberty to bargain. But Brazil is actually making that right now. Brazil went to Europe to say some crazy things about the Ukraine war. And what does mean of that? The Brazil is trying to reinitiate policies that were very successful in the 30s, when Brazil bargained with United States and Nazi Germany to receive public goods that was very important to the important import substitutions programs. So Brazil is right now in the international scenario saying, if you don't pay me, I will be with the other side. And actually, in the end of the day, is trying to use China to receive more from the United States and use the United States to receive more from China.
Thank you very much, Ivan. So I will now turn the floor to Meryl. And Meryl, again, the question of the Monroe Doctrine and what does that mean? And perhaps, and this is a question also for Keith, is that it seems like China trade and China lend always in their own terms, its own terms. And there is this story about Juan Fernandes lobsters. I don't know if you have heard about that, is that Chile decided some years ago to start selling all the Juan Fernandes lobsters that are special lobsters from an island just to China. And every time Chile was going to do a multilateral speech or a multilateral call, something happened with the lobsters and with the trade of the lobsters. And the trade of the lobsters was basically didn't function if Chile was not behaving according to China's parameters. So it will be important for us to hear you on these issues.
To be very simple and very natural, I have the feeling that with China, if I give you something, you give me something. With the US situation in Latin America was, I am giving you something. And Latin America had just to accept. So apparently, the relation between China and Latin America could sound a little bit more equal, a little more balanced between the two countries. Apparently, because since China doesn't forget anything, and when you give something and expect something back, it means that probably the region will be linked to China in a stronger way than it is with the US. Why? Because China will expect a certain allegiance from the Latin American country, not only when it's about trade or investment, but when it's about politics and international politics. I just mentioned that briefly with Taiwan, but I think it's a bigger picture and rule here. And the second point I just want to mention is definitely the potential autonomy of Latin America. We talked about that on Tuesday in a different panel, and I am not sure that we can reasonably consider that one day Latin America would be fully autonomous. Why? Because we're talking about a big bloc. When we talk about the US, China, Russia, any other potential hegemon, we're talking about countries. Latin America is a region, and not even a region comparable to the European Union. Why? Because they don't have the structure in terms of politics and institutions. So it's risky to think that Latin America could be one day fully autonomous. Although it is desirable, it's your point.
Thank you very much. And now, to Keith, I have again this question about China, basically cutting deals under their own terms, and these terms basically deviating or departing from international organizations terms. And also, it seems like China now is like the subprime market for lending money, and having this analogy to the subprime market for mortgages in the US. They are lending money to those players that they do not have a very good record. But in your figures, it called my attention, it puzzled me, the fact that Mexico is on those countries. So I would like you to elaborate on that, please.
Okay. I want to link the finance to the trade issue, and maybe the broader issue of South-South cooperation. So if you're in a multipolar world, and as we've defined it, China is strategically positioning itself in certain regions, but for certain, with a clear rationale. A significant element of that rationale is extraction of resources to be exported back to China for manufacturing and for value addition. When you look at the trade between Latin America and China, it's increasingly moving towards primary exports from Latin America. And so in the literature, it's being defined as the primitivization of Latin America, the deindustrialization of Latin America, and at least more than a decade now, we've had that literature talking about how Latin America's role in the China context is one that is increasingly becoming one of a subordinate partner. And this is a context where China is the largest developing country, is the largest creditor in the world, but it's also the largest driver of South-South trade. So the question then arises, we've long thought about South-South cooperation as an important mechanism to balance against North-South cooperation. Because in North-South cooperation, particularly development cooperation, financing has come with conditionalities. Everything from, are you a democratic country, human rights, and a lot of non-financial conditionalities. Whereas for China, none of these non-financial conditionalities apply for the lending. And so you find that many developing countries are increasingly attracted to gaining finance from China. There's a challenge that is starting to emerge, which is that there's a looming debt crisis of huge proportions, particularly after the pandemic. And so some of the issues that I highlighted with the IDB or with the issue of restructuring debt is going to loom larger in the next decade. And China is going to be the most important and critical player in that regard because of this quantum of debt that developing countries owe to China. And so, questions like the fact that China is not part of the OECD DAC, and so issues like the availability of the data on the financing, so we're using third sources for comparing the data. A lot of issues about confidentiality and transparency have been raised, which Professor Gatti made the point, well, that applies to most lending, so maybe we shouldn't be criticizing China on that standpoint. But for me, the critical concern is that China, I would say, if it wants to play a geopolitical role in relation to South-South cooperation, then maybe we are failing here. So when you look at the Belt and Road Initiative, are we going back to some trade bloc formation whereby those countries that are heavily indebted to China must now, or at least in the coming future, line up with China's geopolitical and geoeconomic requirements? And where does that leave Latin America relative to the United States and even to Europe? So it's going to be very interesting going forward. But I think that one of the things I've been arguing is that we need to shift the financing debate, for example, like aid for trade, to a discussion about aid for innovation. Because if you look at Latin America and the Caribbean, it's one of the regions with the lowest levels of investment in innovation. And so innovation performance is a really important dimension of diversifying the economy. And since 2015, Latin America Caribbean's investment in innovation through R&D as a share of GDP has been in decline. So when you add up all the factors, the privatization of the economy and trade with China, the heavily indebtedness that is coming down the pipeline, and these other deteriorating geopolitical conditions, Latin America and Caribbean are in for a rough ride in the next decade or two.
Okay, Keith, thank you very much for takeaways. And now we open the floor to the public for basically raising some questions. So I don't know, we're a little shy.
Well, I was curious about your spiders network, right? How to calculate the lives? Because I saw that you're talking about 60,000, something like that. What's this?
The size of the lines is just to put everything on the map.
But arrangements?
Yeah, the network that I use is not taking using the proportionality of trade or something like that. Just putting if it's 0 or 1, if there is a relation, there isn't the relation. So we can rely on those that are more close, those that are more far apart, but we cannot rely on the size of the line.
Because it's interesting, yes, it's a kind of airplane network, yes. But I was curious about your voice, 16,000. There are only 400 agreements notified to the WHO. So
yeah, but it's by country. So there is
okay. The line by country. Yes.
200 agreements. So you have a very important number.
And how about the future, Keith? Can you imagine Latin America completely abandoned by United States and in the hand of China?
No, of course not. This is going to be increased competition and rivalry. So if you look at what happened in the 19th century, trade bloc formation, dollar zone, sterling zone, the Japanese prosperity sphere. These things are all coming back again. And so one can well imagine that multipolar system is going to generate a significant level of rivalry. This means that the multilateral institutions that we've developed over the last several decades are going to decline in importance with a stronger focus on bilateralism. This means it will weaken the negotiating power for peripheral economies, small economies, least developed countries. Brazil may be able to negotiate, but most of the other countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, what you said, they will be on the menu. Well, they are on the menu.
That's not mine. So
I know it's not your expression.
That's not
Marvelous, yeah, I like it.
Yeah.
So please, another question.
I'm Moshe Hirsch from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. I would like to ask Meryl. It was very interesting with what you said about patterns of reciprocity. You said that when China lends you money, so they have a specific and immediate result from you. They want you something to do immediately. And with regard to the US, it is something more long-term expectation. Is it because China is newer in international politics and the US is more sophisticated, or is it something more cultural? I mean, why you think China, it demands much more immediate response or benefit?
Business. Lend you money.
And the US, okay, no.
Sorry, Meryl. Yeah, no, you should just take it in. Okay. Very interesting. To be honest, I'm not a Chinese specialist. I'm a Latin American specialist. So I will make some assumption. It might be because of the culture. I do assume that the Chinese legal and political culture is very different from the one of the West. So for that reason, the relation is different. It can be as well, and it's maybe a little bit more probable because of security. When you enter in a new territory that is already driven by an hegemon, you need to be more secure when you will make an agreement. So this sort of I give you, you give me, and right now or as fast and as obviously possible can be a way to gain security in the region and to affirm its presence.
So first,
So thank you for a very interesting presentation. I want to take Keith's point as a point of departure and then ask you all to comment a little bit more on the geopolitical dimension. So if we presume, right, that the coming decade is going to be a difficult one for several countries in Latin America because of a looming financing crisis, right, then we can also presume that politically there will be one of two different types of responses, right? Either we will see a left-wing populist response, as we've seen in some countries, or we will see a move towards a more of a strongman, possibly rightist, possibly whatever you want to call it, right, quasi-authoritarian type of response. Then there's the difference also in size, big countries versus small countries within the blocks and so forth. What I want to ask is that if this is the forecast that I think this panel is forecasting for the coming decade, what does the domestic politics of Latin America then mean for how you would choose to handle the US-China rivalry? In other words, would a left-wing populist government respond differently to sort of a set of sticks and carrots compared to a right-wing authoritarian? Is this mantra of fighting back against authoritarianism is having a resonance here or not? What about the technological surveillance technologies that are being put into place and so forth? So I wanted to ask you to comment a little bit more on the domestic politics and what that would mean for the region.
Okay, well, let's take a couple of questions. So Werner and Professor Van den Bosch.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you for the presentations. I learned a lot. My first question, I think, goes to Ivan. You mentioned at one point that the expectations regarding plurilateral negotiations, you refer to the plurilateral system, but I assume that it's the plurilateral negotiations, that the expectations were that there would be very little gains, plural. I'm a bit surprised about that because many Latin American countries are actually very much in the driving seat, pushing these plurilateral negotiations that are currently ongoing at the WTO, are the facilitators of these negotiations. So if you care to explain why you think that not much is expected from this. Another question, or perhaps more a comment, relates to what you said, I think it was you, on China as upholding the rule of law. I think that is definitely the case within the WTO. If you look at compliance with dispute settlement rulings, I think then the comment was perhaps made that well, there's little transparency about that compliance. So is there really compliance? But I would say that if there was no compliance, you would see the complainant in the original case to come back. Yeah? And if a complainant does not come back, he was at least sufficiently satisfied with what China did. But I may be wrong on this. And then I have a question for the whole panel. Mark has asked you to focus on the domestic dimension. I would like you to say a bit more about the relationship of Latin American countries to the United States. The point is made, and it was very well made, that many Latin American countries have now very strong economic links with China. You mentioned Chile, you mentioned Peru. So how do you see the relationship of Latin America now and in the near future with the United States? Thank you.
Thank you. I think some of my questions have already been posed. I wanted to add one to Meryl's presentation about this issue of how China versus acts differently from the United States, and Peter also raised it. Probably there's traditionally not a perception of equality with which the United States sees Latin America, and maybe China is a newcomer, at least to begin with, has this more transactional approach of equality. Can you develop your model a little bit further? There is something is given, something is expected in return. I'm not sure to what extent the problem exists in Latin America as it does in Africa, that huge infrastructure investments financed by China, on the one hand, help bring Chinese goods into the continent, but create very quickly dependence because the calculations of benefits and profits are done in a way that they usually don't match and lead to default. And in many African contexts, then the infrastructure projects become property of China. This problem, to what extent does it exist in Latin America, and how do Latin American countries react to it? Is there a backlash visible like in Africa, that this donations with a lot of infrastructure financing is followed by dependence through debt?
We will go back to so please, Ivan, if you can start.
I think for the first questions that I don't know the names of you, sorry for that. I think there is an issue that is important to address, that there is very different regions in Latin American and Caribbean. Actually, Latin American Caribbean, it's a very broad term that put much things different together. And when I talk that it's not going to, its problem with the plurilateral agenda is more related with the connoisseur, with Mercosur, with Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay than other partners of Latin America, that Peru, Chile, they are much more close to those agreements, because there is an issue on how Brazil can maintain and Argentina maintain what we have of industry. And there is and the example that we have very strong right now is the example of the negotiation with Mercosur and European Union. Actually, Latin American Caribbean is everything in America without United States and Canada, and put much things difference together. And I think we need to understand a little apart what's going to happen in Central America. It will be different than what's going to happen in South America. South America, you'll be really dependent on how Brazil you'll be able to put itself in this kind of a global conflict. If Brazil is able to have a position to bargain with United States and China, and as a reliable democracy, it will put pressure on the other partners in South America to be stable, or at least not so unstable democracies. If Brazil cannot do that, you'll be a very different situation. In Central America, that is more close to the United States, things will be much more intensified than South America.
Very much, Ivan. So, Meryl.
So we'll try to answer in 3 points. There is a big disease in Latin America, regionalism. There is a creation of regional institutions for all and nothing most of the time. Some of them are quite successful, the CAN, Mercosur, some other not so much. I think about UNASUR, which has been a big project, but day after day is not such a success. So we have that to observe, and it goes to the answer for domestic policies and what is the situation in Latin America compared with, the relation Latin America, China, and US. Domestic here in Latin America, I think, is very hard to define because we have so many specificities and such that weakness that is an illusion for a lot of small countries in the region to affirm their willingness or their power. So that being said, I think that if the US wants to still have a role in the region, it has to open its market and to give Latin American countries the opportunity to import technologies, new products that China will offer to them. That's the first thing. Second, regarding infrastructure and the comparison between Latin America and Africa, unfortunately, I do consider that Latin America is more or less in the same situation as Africa. Why? Because we already have debt situation in Venezuela. Venezuela is the largest borrower of the continent with China. And today, the debt of Venezuela with China is very important. So it makes the country in a difficult situation. Brazil as well has some debt concerns with China. I work in San Luis do Maranhão, and we have a big port there. And all the importation, all the trade that is done here is with China. So Brazil is definitely conceding part of its territory to China because of this relation. So for Latin America, it's not a good deal. For China, it's way more secure to invest in Latin America than in Africa because of the stability, the political stability. Although I speak that way because it's still complicated, but it's a big opportunity.
Thank you very much. We'll turn the floor to Keith. So Keith, please.
Okay, I'll just make one quick comment. If indeed it's correct that we can expect a looming debt crisis, one of the key elements of this enhanced indebtedness, particularly external indebtedness, is the problem of declining fiscal space, erosion or the rollback of social services. We're talking about declining investments in education, health, infrastructure, etc. All of these signal an impending both social crisis, what we call social indebtedness, as well as some political crises. So the political pendulum is likely to swing wider, as I think Mark is suggesting. So this is really going to be very interesting going forward. And when you look at the way in which the Chinese contracts for the debt, so for example, they explicitly commit borrowers to exclude debt from restructuring within the Paris Club and other multilateral areas of restructuring. The Chinese contracts also contain what are called cross-default and cross-cancellation clauses, which gives China greater relational power over these countries. And the list goes on. And so you're now going to see a scenario where the domestic context is rapidly declining, and China will have significant power over both external as well as internal issues, because now the debt, it can almost be defined as a debt peonage scenario that is going to be evolving. So it's going to make Latin America increasingly unstable. When in fact, when you look at the data, Latin America already has the highest level of inequality of all regions, if you look at the Gini coefficients. And these coefficients, which measure the level of inequality, are only likely to get sharper and more problematic. So the question I think that China has to be asking itself is, well, going forward, do I need these developing country regions to be strategic partners or to be subordinates?
Very good question.
Yeah.
We'll have a last round very quickly. So Michelle first, and then who else? I think
So thank you. I guess that in line with the metaphor of the panel, we have a lot of food for thought. Thank you for the information. But I would like to push a little bit further. My question is that based on the results of outputs of your analysis, and if you take Latin American history, there is nothing new there. There's nothing new. This is the history of Latin America. Latin America was never autonomous. Latin America was ever in debt. Latin America ever had problems with getting troubles with institutions that would be there and never more. So what is new there? We know that there is a new game in town, and China is the new player. And so I would maybe ask you if you have any other analysis, especially thinking about the legal perspective. What is new there? What is China? Because we get the database for loans, for example, we don't have a comparable database for other countries, for example. Let's check what are the debts with other countries bilaterally, including all cooperation agreements. We don't have the data comparing private loans and private debt. And the fact is that China is also applying its Chinese structures and also replicating the developed and Western standards of indebtedness. So I would like to push a little bit more on your cases on trade agreements, on loans. What do you see that is really specifically new in the case of China, especially in the legal perspective? Are there new arrangements there?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for. Thank you very much for your presentations. I enjoyed them very much. I was wondering if you could put your findings in the context of the energy transformation that is going on in many regions, especially in the West, and the urgent need for raw materials, and the fact that the Latin American regions has these raw materials. How do you think can this region leverage this economic power That's it.
Thank you very much. So,
I don't have a legal perspective because I'm not a legal scholar. So I have no idea to answer you, but I think that there's something very different. It's the first time for the last 200 years, there is somebody that is really competing with the power, with the geopolitical power. The United States did not compete against England in Latin America. When the United States came, England went out. The United States did not compete with Soviet Union. Soviet Union was not able to provide public goods for Latin America. Right now, there is somebody that is really competitive, that has technological capacities to compete with US for the Latin American territory. So it is a question how the Latin American countries will be able to use this position to bargain better solutions. I think that bigger countries as Brazil, as Argentina, as Colombia, you'll be able to have a better bargain than smaller countries. So it will really depend, and I think it's really important to understand how those big countries will react in this situation and how the smaller countries will be able to catch on the reactions of the big countries in Latin America.
Thank you very much. So, Meryl.
Just 1 minute. So, global answer, China doesn't forget. So since it doesn't forget, it changed everything because the connection, it can be because of trade and raw materials or any other stuff, can be about investment. But if China doesn't forget, it means that Latin America will always have material and immaterial debt for China. And this is for me the main change compared with the US.
Thank you very much. So Keith, give you the floor.
Okay. It's a really hard question to answer. Your question, what's new? Because what I've described is, in fact, historically, the traditional relationship between Latin America and external creditors and key external trade partners. However, I would argue that maybe we need to negotiate better with China in the sense that China keeps arguing that what they are doing is different from the West. So they keep saying, development finance with Chinese characteristics. That the donor-recipient relationship is not like what it is in the West. I don't think we are arguing or negotiating hard enough to get China to provide investment, for example, into innovation to facilitate the diversification of our economies. Because this is where China's extraction framework, because they are going after the critical minerals, which is in part involved in the race, the geopolitical race with the other trade blocs. So we want to argue, and this is my point from my last comment, which is that we need to be positioning ourselves in Latin American Caribbean to be a strategic partner with China under South-South cooperation. What does that South-South cooperation model involve? And it needs to involve not just lending for extraction, it needs to have now a lending or framework focused on building capacity. Because if Latin American Caribbean declines, then it doesn't favor China's strategy going forward for the long term. So one of the key elements of the Chinese philosophy is a long-term view. I think we need to negotiate on that basis. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Keith. So thank you very much. And I will ask you to join me in a big applause to our panel. Thank you.